Welcome to Shift Happens. This is the weekly podcast that deconstructs the most recent episode of Bullshift, the podcast, and offers some specific, tangible suggestions about what you can do to help make better financial decisions in your personal life. On Thursday, we spoke with Anna Malazhavaya. Anna is a lawyer at Advotax Law, and she is a tax specialist who had lots of thoughts about what we can be doing with regard to the proposed increase in the capital gains inclusion rate in the most recent budget. Specifically, we spoke about her excellent article that appeared in the Globe and Mail on Saturday, May 4th. And she had lots of examples of how it might affect you personally and what you might be doing. This is a different thing for the Bullshift podcast series because Bullshift usually talks about ideas that are in the book, but from time to time, there are things that are happening in the real world that need to be addressed as line items, as topical things that need to be considered because they're right on the agenda and everyone's talking about it. Certainly, the changes in the most recent federal budget, which include the change to the capital gains inclusion rate, but there are some other things as well, are among those. So in terms of what you can do specifically to take advantage of the inclusion rate, obviously, if you think you're going to be affected and you have the wherewithal to sell things before June 24th, you can do so. But most people, in most instances, most people don't have a problem because they don't have pregnant capital gains that they're sitting on at that order of magnitude. But even if you are, in many instances, it makes sense not to do anything. If it's marketable securities, as we talked about on the podcast, we can let those out in dribs and drabs over a number of years, and keeping all the realized gains under $250,000 per year, thereby never triggering a higher inclusion rate, even if you do it for a few $1,000,000, if you have a long enough time to live. The other thing that you need to think of is that a lot of experts are now of the opinion that even though it's likely the inclusion rate will in fact bump up on June 25th, even though the legislation hasn't been passed, you have to think about the time value of money and accelerating a capital gains liability when you don't think you're going to be selling something for many, many years, 10 or 15 years down the road, probably doesn't make sense. And people have actually crunched numbers. Assuming a 5% rate of return in the investment, then as long as you can wait 8 or 9 years, you will likely be as well off or better off having waited rather than having accelerated your capital gain in the short term. That's especially important if you have, for instance, a family cottage and you want to spend time with your family for the next little while. It might very well be a situation where you're better off holding onto the property for a long time, deferring your taxes for a very long time, and then paying a higher tax bill, but paying that higher tax bill 10 or 15 years down the road once other things have changed. The other thing that people often forget is that once upon a time, the capital gains inclusion rate in Canada was 75%. So even though the capital gains inclusion rate has gone in certain instances now from 50% to 2/3, it can go higher still, and it can go back down again too. These are the sorts of things that, as we just saw in the most recent budget proposal, change from time to time. They don't change every year, but sometimes if you wait 10 or 15 years, it changes again. And if you're looking at holding on to things for a long time, then that might be another consideration for you as well. The other thing that wasn't mentioned in the podcast with Anna was that there are other elements in the budget that offset these changes to the inclusion rate that might actually be beneficial. So one thing that I will point out is that the lifetime capital gains exemption for small businesses in Canada has been increased from just over $1,000,000 to $1.25 million. So if you have shares in a Canadian-controlled private corporation, a CCPC, that you have held for more than 2 years and they've appreciated, you can sell them after the 2 years of holding period without triggering any capital gains tax whatsoever on the first $1.25 million. So that's done to encourage entrepreneurship and starting small businesses and that sort of thing. So there are things that are in the budget that are at least to some extent, offsets to what was seen as being a more punitive tax measure to raise some money for the government. I hope that helps, and we'll see you next week.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager in Toronto and the author of the book Bullshift: How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances. Bullshift is available online and in bookstores everywhere. The opinions expressed in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Bullshift, the podcast, is produced by TalkShoe, a division of IOTM.